Hi, and welcome to the Boulder Climbing Community's Anchor Replacement Program Part 1 training. These slides were updated in February of 2025. The BCC has been involved in bolt replacement since 2013 and replaced over 4,500 bolts to date. We've worked at numerous crags in areas like Boulder Canyon, Clear Creek Canyon, the Flatirons, North Table Mountain, Rocky Mountain National Park, Shelf Road, and more. This is a 3-part training program focused on base knowledge and hands-on practice. In later trainings, there will be ongoing assessment of core principles and proficiency. Afterward, volunteers are eligible for official BCC rebolt events and to receive further mentorship. Volunteers are encouraged to apply for BCC hardware grants when comfortable. With a successful application to a BCC hardware grant, you'll receive the necessary fixed hardware for your rebolt project, be able to check out a set of tools, and request any further assistance. Rope access is beyond the scope of what we teach through our anchor replacement program. Volunteers are encouraged to obtain competent training via guide service or mentor for skills applicable to aid climbing and self-rescue. These are the stages of the ARP training. You're currently at Part 1, which involves base knowledge of fixed hardware and policies. During Part 2, you'll have hands-on training with skills and self-assessment. And in Part 3, you'll be able to shadow a skilled rebolter for real-life experience. Once again, all ARP volunteers are strongly encouraged to seek independent instruction for rope work and feel confident safely ascending and descending fixed lines. Here are some of the objectives of the Part 1 training. Knowledge of the state of fixed hardware in the Front Range, knowledge of national and local policies around fixed anchor maintenance, the importance of hardware replacement and key ethics, understanding of BCC's ARP policies, and basic bolt identification and assessment skills. You must complete the Part 1 quiz to move on to Part 2. This is just a slice of climbing history in the area. For those who are interested, there are books on the subject such as Climb, The History of Rock Climbing Colorado by Jeff Akey, Dudley Shelton, and Bob Godfrey. It's available in the CU Boulder Rare Book Collection for those interested. The first successful use of bolts in the Boulder area was on the east ridge of the Maiden. This was in 1953 when the first ascent happened. However, the first attempted use of bolts was on another route on the Third Flatiron called Northwest Passage. Early climbing wasn't concerned with long-term sustainability. Climbers were only interested in protecting the climbs and reaching the summit, so they used any and all hardware they could find. There was a wide variety of hardware with varying degrees of strength, even from some of the first manufacturers of climbing hardware. We generally describe bolts during this period up until the 80s as dangerous. Here are some examples of hardware you might find from this early era. Here you can see a 1/4-inch split shaft bolt that's threaded for tightening down a hanger. These particular hangers were called leapers for Ed Leeper, who in the 60s began manufacturing climbing hardware in the Boulder area. Leaper hangers were some of the first commercially available, and for that reason had some serious issues and recalls. They were prone to stress corrosion cracking, which was particularly dangerous on the thinner made hangers like this one. 1/4-inch diameter split shaft bolts are also problematic, which we'll talk more about later. Here's another bolt from the earlier part of this era. It's a 1/4-inch diameter threaded split shaft with another leaper hanger. It came off the west face route on the Matron and the Flatirons. You'll still find some of these bolts on classic routes where people use them, but not as the only pro. This leaper hanger is slightly thicker with a larger carabiner hole than the last one pictured. This is another bolt removed from the west face of the Matron. It's from the later part of this era, a mechanical expansion bolt we call a wedge bolt rather than a compression split shaft bolt. It has a larger diameter than the split shaft, which makes it a lot stronger. But as you can see, it suffers from the same corrosion issues. The hanger is a stainless SMC, note the stamp on it. It's typically found in the 80s and 90s. This last one is a 3/8 inch diameter sleeve bolt, which is another mechanical expansion bolt more commonly found later. The hanger looks a lot like leaper hangers, but this one is homemade judging by the larger shaped carabiner hole. It was removed from El Dorado Canyon on a route that's had its name redacted. Originally, it was known as Trail of Tears. We'll show a few more bolts, mostly from the later part of that early era. This one was likely installed earlier than the rest. It's similar to the threaded split shaft we already saw. It's known as a button head for the round bolt head you hammer to set it. It's also 1/4 inch in diameter. This one is paired with a thicker leaper hanger. This bolt is missing its sleeve, but is known as a self-drive bolt. They're sometimes referred to as drop-ins. You'll notice the stud is very short. These bolts are often found in caving and were never meant to be permanent. Attached to it is a newer SMC hanger. It was removed from Golden Gate Canyon State Park on a route whose name was redacted, formerly Lazy Squaw Spire. This is another threaded split shaft bolt, one with a 3/8 inch diameter, but essentially they work the same way as the smaller 1/4 inch split shafts. It would be hard to identify from the outside whether this bolt is a wedge bolt or a split shaft due to the threads, but split shafts of this size are relatively rare now. It was removed from Pinnacles National Park in California. This is another threaded 1/4 inch split shaft with a recalled SMC hanger. It's sometimes known as the SMC death hanger for its thin material and tendency for stress corrosion cracking, or cracks that form as a result of corrosion and tensile stresses. Leaper hangers were also prone to stress corrosion cracking. Stress corrosion cracking can occur in non-stainless hardware, but we've also seen this in stainless in coastal areas over the last few decades, leading to the use of titanium hardware. Here's a comparison of SMC hangers side by side. On the left, you have an older recalled SMC hanger, and on the right, you have a newer stainless SMC hanger. Notice how the hanger material on the left is much thinner. One easy way to recognize the recalled hanger from the newer ones is a horizontal stamp on the death hanger and a vertical stamp on the stainless. A few more examples of older hardware. All of these are 1/4 inch split shafts. On the top left, the bolt has an aluminum hanger. The bolt below the hanger actually has a square nut on it. To the right, we have a button head with a leaper hanger. On the bottom, this threaded split shaft has a homemade hanger on it. Smith Rock was considered the birthplace of modern sport climbing, and the period that followed gave way to a lot of bolting. Blank faces in places like the Flatirons, El Dorado Canyon, and Boulder Canyon were now something that would go with bolts. A lot of these routes make up today's classics. Most of the bolts you'll find along the Front Range came from this period, and there was a general improvement in safety. But as we'll see, there were still a variety of styles and no shared standards. Many developers were economizing to put up as many routes as possible. There was also a limited understanding of how mixed metals would react. Sometimes you might even find bolts that were sealed with epoxy or caulk, but this often led to more corrosion from trapping water in the bolt hole. Here are a few obscure bolts you might find from this period. On the top left, you have a larger self-drilling bolt removed from the Black Canyon. This would have had a cone in the back of the sleeve, causing it to expand when it was hammered in. On the right, we have a ring bolt, which works in a similar way. On the bottom is an unknown type that looks a bit like a wedge bolt. This may have been a concrete anchor of some sort that was hammered in to get the sleeve to expand. The hanger is an old commercial Mammut hanger. Here's another view of how a self-drive bolt works. You can see the teeth on the end of the sleeve. They'd often become quite worn. The sleeve was attached to a hand drill and turned as you hammer it. After the hole was drilled, the cone would be placed in the back and hammered back into the hole. They're quite short and had to be installed perfectly flush. They can look similar to sleeve bolts from the outside because they also have a hex head. However, self-drive bolts often have a larger hex head. Here are a few more bolts from this period. On the top left, we have another unknown threaded bolt with an integrated sleeve and a cone in the back. This would set once the bolt was hammered in. It was likely something cheap from the hardware store, and the hanger looks homemade. On the top right, we have a modern sleeve bolt with a 3/8 diameter. Sometimes these are referred to as a 5-piece for the 5 parts that make up the bolt. It's a plated steel bolt. The hanger is a modern fix brand made of stainless steel. Also, that might be one reason why this bolt is so corroded, because of the sped up galvanic corrosion resulting from mixing metals. Finally, on the bottom we have a short 3/8 wedge bolt with a stainless SMC hanger. Note the vertical SMC stamp. The bolt is pretty corroded on the inside, again probably due to mixing metals. Some of the modern day problems. We're no longer dealing with the very real dangerous hardware issues from the 60s to 80s. Very few accidents tend to happen from fixed hardware failing. Climbers are much more likely to tie their knot wrong or lower off the end of a rope. The new problems we're seeing are substandard bolts. These are plated steel bolts that are getting rusty and starting to reach the end of their lifespan. You can find serious pitting in a lot of hardware in places like Shelf Road where the rock is limestone. Often the excessive amount of rust and age reduces our chances of removing bolts without chopping and patching. The American Safe Climbing Association is a national organization that publishes universal guidelines for new bolts and anchors, as well as replacement hardware. They recommend using grade 304 stainless steel or higher corrosion resistance for all new routes or replacement bolts and anchors. BCC standards follow along with the ASCA guidelines. All bolts we use for replacement in the front country are a minimum 1/2 inch diameter and at least 2 3/4 inch in length. We also use glue ends as much as possible as they're a long-term sustainable option. Glue ends do not require as much maintenance, while mechanical bolts sometimes need to be retorqued due to the freeze-thaw cycle, heavy use, etc. It's best to check with the local climbing organization in your area about specific preferences for hardware. Here are some examples of modern hardware. On the top left, we have a stainless 3/8 inch by 3.5 inch wedge bolt with a stainless hanger. These are appropriate in good quality rock, but don't work very well in sandstone or other soft rock. On the right, we have a 1/2 inch by 2 3/4 inch stainless steel sleeve bolt with a stainless hanger. These are often called 5-piece bolts. The longer sleeve on these bolts makes them more versatile and appropriate in softer rock. They can also be tightened to a higher torque and are a stronger bolt than the 3/8 wedge bolt. Finally, at the bottom is a glue-in bolt that fits in a 1/2 inch diameter hole. This model is called a wave bolt for the interference fit the bent rod creates. Other bolts don't have an interference fit and need to be installed rather specifically. Let's talk about policies around fixed anchors. Bolts are a sensitive topic for most land managers. In the past, they were generally placed without approval of any sort. Things have changed quite a bit over the last 20 years, and now we have policies the climbing community helped author, so we can have a shared conversation about this. You can learn more by reading the Joint Access Fund and American Alpine Club policy. To provide an excerpt, the purpose of the policy is to provide the climbing community, partner organizations, community stakeholders, agency officials, and land managers with a clear and consistent policy position regarding the placement, maintenance, and management of fixed anchors for technical climbing. There's a clear distinction between wilderness and front country areas. If interested, you can also read about recent challenges to fixed hardware in wilderness areas and the introduction of the Explore Act. Let's mention some of the local climbing area policies on fixed anchors. We want to encourage climbers to know who owns the land they're climbing on and understand policies can be very different from one crag to another. An area like Rocky Mountain National Park is managed by the National Park Service, where there is a programmatic authorization for bolting. Rocky Mountain National Park has a wilderness management plan that should be referenced, and all National Park Service directors' orders should be followed. On top of that, the National Park Service policies align with the Wilderness Act, which strictly prohibits the use of motorized drills. All drilling must be done with a hand drill. The U.S. Forest Service managed areas like Boulder Canyon have no national or unit-specific policy. Fixed hardware is more or less fair game. Boulder County managed land like Castle Rock has a moratorium on new bolts and requires the express written permission for bolt replacement technically. Violations can lead to serious issues and closures. Castle Rock and other crags are within Boulder Canyon, but looking at a land management map can provide more context. Jefferson County Open Space has a programmatic system for route development as well. You can find their permitting process online, which is reviewed by a climber-involved committee. Rebolting, however, doesn't require a permit, but Jeffco Open Space requests that rebolters report their work within 3 days. Boulder Open Space and Mountain Parks, or OSMP, has a tightly regulated process for new route development. The Flatirons Climbing Council is heavily involved and set up a fixed hardware review process where the community can approve or disapprove of new route proposals. You can visit their website at flatironsclimbing.org for more detailed information. Rebolting also requires a permit through OSMP that can be found on the City of Boulder's website. El Dorado Canyon State Park has a volunteer-run organization called Action Committee for El Dorado, similar to FCC's involvement with OSMP. They have a fixed hardware review process in place and advocate for climbers when working with the park. One thing of note for Eldo is the replacement of fixed pins are referred to ACE and require a public review. You can view their fixed hardware guidelines that outline all procedures at aceeldo.org. Staunton State Park also has a programmatic system in place for route development. They have a volunteer-run group called the Staunton Fixed Hardware Review Group you can refer to for more information. If any of this seems confusing, it's okay. We mostly want you to err on the side of caution and to do your due diligence. Always reach out if you're in doubt. It's important to note some of the ethics around bolt replacement. Hardware, both old and new, requires maintenance at some point, and making sure hardware is functional and safe is a collective responsibility for all climbers. This rappel ring has seen some wear. If you look closely, it's actually been flipped and has wear in 2 spots. The carabiner on the left was used as a makeshift mussy hook. It was replaced with a durable lower-off. The carabiner on the right is also getting close to replacement. Some of the key ethics we keep in mind for bolt replacement. Reusing the existing hole. Climbable rock is a finite resource. Use high-quality hardware. The ASCA recommended hardware will likely last 50 to 100 years. The safety of rebolters and climbers is of utmost importance. Accidents can create major issues with land management and community and first ascensionist involvement. Unilateral decisions can lead to precipitating issues. Whenever dealing with classic routes, alterations to climbs, retrobolting, try and get more consensus. Here are some of the high-level BCC ARP policies. The ARP will provide assistance for the following actions. Replacing substandard bolts, preferably reusing the same hole. Adding or removing anchor materials such as chain, quick links, rappel rings, mussy hooks, etc. when necessary. Moving bolt location due to the hole not being reusable or the original location objectively poor. For example, too close to an edge, in fractured rock, too close to other fixed hardware, etc. Adding and updating information about fixed hardware to public databases, such as Mountain Project, Open Beta, etc. Patch and or repair aesthetic issues associated with replacement work. Provide educational clinics for community members and volunteers. And as a note, for all actions, land manager or owner approval must be obtained if required. Some of the actions that the ARP will not engage in. Replacing non-bolt fixed hardware with a bolt or non-bolt fixed hardware. Funding and or placing fixed hardware for new route development. Funding and or placing new fixed hardware on already existing climbs. For example, retrobolting. Moving the location of bolts for aesthetic or practical reasons. Or providing or replacing fixed quick draws, for example, permadraws. Some rebolting guidelines. All bolts, hangers, and quick links will be stainless steel and rated for use in climbing applications. All manufacturer guidelines will be followed during installation. BCC provided bolts will have a minimum diameter of 1/2 inch and a minimum length of 2 3/4 inches. Existing bolts will be allowed to stay if they're stainless steel, 3/8 in diameter, and textbook placement and installation. Quick links and chains will have a minimum diameter of 5/16 of an inch. For glue-in bolts, appropriate adhesives will be used. For example, DeWalt AC100 Plus Gold, Redhead A7 Plus, or other comparable construction adhesives. Let's mention some common forces on bolts before moving on to bolt types. Bolts experience both tension and shear forces from climbers. Tension forces are those that work by pulling the bolt along the axis it was placed. Shear forces work across the axis of the bolt, or the force it experiences from a fall on the hanger across the bolt stud. Bolts will have different ratings for tensile strength and shear strength. However, certain bolts installed in soft rock could theoretically fail in tension before they break. Likewise, soft rock may break when the bolt is loaded in shear, also making it more prone to rip out. This diagram from a paper published by MDPI in the journal Materials illustrates the cone of force that mechanical bolts create once tensioned, specifically how rock can break in scenarios where mechanical bolts are spaced more closely. Cones of force are relative to bolt lengths and depths when placed. If you're interested in more nuance, you can view the open access paper at the link in the description. We mostly want people to take away that care should be taken with mechanical bolt spacing. This can also help rebolters make more informed decisions when selecting bolts for use. For example, using glue-in bolts which behave differently and aren't subject to the same forces as mechanical bolts. They're an excellent choice when placing bolts closely spaced or nearly contacting original placements. Let's go over some bolt types. Here you can see a handful of compression-style bolts. The rightmost is a threaded split shaft, while the left three are button-head split shafts. The stud shaft is split in order to make it slightly larger than the hole. When the bolt is hammered in, it compresses, pushing outward on the side of the hole. These have a low shear strength due to their small diameter, especially the 1/4 inch size. They also have a low tension strength since they're only held in by compression from the split shaft. They can be strong when new and installed in hard rock. Here's another view of a split shaft button head. This is a new bolt with a new leaper hanger. Here's the same bolt next to a button head that was removed last year in Upper Dream Canyon. The hanger was pulled and you can see the button head actually cracked. Another early type of bolt is what we call a sheath bolt. Basically, it's a steel nail driven into a metal sleeve, often with a small amount of lead on the end. The lead is relatively soft and the rock bites into it when the nail expands the sleeve. The nail together with the sleeve makes a 1/4 inch diameter bolt. Here's a star drive-in bolt, denoted by the star stamp on the nail head, installed with a leaper hanger. You can see the lead on the end of the sleeve to the right. It was removed from Upper Dream Canyon last year. Here are a few star drive-ins found at the Dark Side and Shelf Road. These were replaced in 2022. Wedge bolts are a type of mechanical expansion bolt that has a small expansion clip or sleeve. When they're tightened down, their cone expands the clip out against the rock and prevents it from pulling out in tension. These 3/8 diameter bolts have a high shear strength and a medium to high tension strength. All of these are wedge bolts, with the exception of number 3, shown here as an example of how it might be confused with a wedge bolt. 6, 5, and 1 are what we typically call a wedge bolt with a distinguishable clip sliding over a cone at the back. Number 6 actually has double clips. 4 and 2 are what are known as lock bolts. They have a longer sleeve but still have a single piece stud and cone. They're inferior in strength for the same diameter bolt. Here's what a wedge bolt would look like from the outside and a profile below. You can see that it has a nut that tightens down onto a threaded stud over the hanger. The end of the stud has a stamped letter. This often refers to the length of the wedge bolt. In this case, B means the bolt is 2 inches long. The one pictured below is likely stamped D or E for 3 and 3.5 inches respectively. Here's an exploded wedge bolt so we can see how it works. You'll notice the sleeve or expansion clip is slightly larger than the hole. The rock bites into that and keeps it from moving as we tighten down the nut. This pulls the cone into the expansion clip and causes it to expand, pushing out against the wall of the hole. Once we've reached the manufacturer's recommended torque, the bolt is installed. One of the downsides of wedge bolts is the sleeve or clip is small, so the range isn't very large. It leaves a pretty small margin for error when installing. Also, the nut can fall off along with the hanger if it's not torqued to spec. Here's a close-up view of the cone and the expansion clip. This is a wedge bolt from the Estes Park Valley, stamped B and about 2 inches long total. It had just over an inch of working depth and was removed relatively easily from softer rock. Sleeve bolts are a popular option and are the strongest of the mechanical expansion bolts. They come in a variety of sizes. The 3/8 inch size is standard for alpine replacement, and the 1/2 inch size is standard for front country. They work similarly to wedge bolts, but are much more versatile. Sometimes they're referred to as a 5-piece for the 5 parts that make up the shorter version. Powers was one of the manufacturers of the 5-piece. These bolts have a high shear strength and a high tension strength. The longer version can be used in lower quality rock where expansion needs to be deeper. Here you can see what a sleeve bolt looks like from the outside and a profile below. This is a 1/2 inch by 2 3/4 inch sleeve bolt. The hanger is drilled for a 3/8 inch hole, so it doesn't require a washer. For a 1/2 inch hole hanger, the washer is required. This is an exploded sleeve bolt to show how it works. In the very back is a slightly oversized cone. When the bolt is installed, the cone compresses slightly and then expands when the stud is tightened. This keeps the cone from spinning, but still pulls it into the expansion sleeve. This sleeve has a larger surface area than the wedge bolt clip and expands tightly against the rock. The plastic expansion collar helps keep it from loosening over time. Next, the metal spacer fits into 1/2 inch hole hangers or sits below 3/8 hangers. Then the 3/8 stud goes through a washer and hanger and tightens into the cone. Here's another view of the sleeve bolt as the cone drives the sleeve's expansion. Another thing to note is the hanger hole size for use with 1/2 inch sleeve bolts. 3/8 inch hole hangers do not require a washer over the hanger because the hex head of the bolt completely covers the hole in the hanger. It's important to always use the metal spacer with the larger 1/2 inch hole hangers as well as the washer. The metal spacer fits into the 1/2 inch hole hanger to keep it from moving around. Likewise, the washer, which has a 3/8 inch hole, covers the hanger hole completely. Glue-in bolts are popular and come in a variety of styles and sizes. The 2 main styles are single leg bolts with a welded eye and one-piece designs where they're often twisted or bent to allow for glue to fill gaps. Glue-ins are a bit of a misnomer because the glue doesn't stick to the metal, but rather keeps the metal from being tensioned out of the hole. They're held in place by construction adhesive such as epoxy or vinyl ester. They have a high shear strength and the highest tension strength. They're great in roofs and can be very effective in poor rock with glue holding together the surrounding stone. Here's an example of a single leg design glue-in called a wave bolt. This bolt has an interference fit, meaning it needs to be driven in with a hammer and it behaves a little like a compression bolt. Other glue-in bolts might not have an interference fit and must be dry fitted prior to installation. Here are some hangers to watch out for. These are known as cold shuts. They start as the cold shut link on the left and are bent and welded together to form what's on the right. Often these are welded together in someone's garage and there's no quality control. Here are some more examples of homemade hangers. A handful are aluminum, some are actually cut out from a bed frame, and there's even one made from a piton. These cold shuts all look a little bit different. Some may have been welded better than others. Here's an example of a stacked washer hanger. You'll notice that the second link down prevents the first one from sitting flush against the rock. To fix this, there's a stack of washers underneath the first link, pulling the bolt out from the wall considerably. If these wedge bolts are short, the expansion clip might not be far from the edge of the wall. In addition, since the chain link is away from the rock, it creates a lever and places more force on the bolt. Let's move on to assessment for bolts, hangers, and lowering hardware. Here are some things to keep in mind. Try and ID the hardware. You can use a magnet to test if it's a plated bolt or stainless. Plated will attract strongly to a magnet, and stainless will be weak or not attracted. Figure out what type of rock it's in. Is it hard, solid granite, or something soft like desert sandstone? Try and identify how old it is by using things like the first ascent data or when hardware would have been made. Look for surface rust on the bolt, hanger, or both. Check for any movement. Spinning hangers aren't necessarily dangerous, but loose bolts are. Also look for wear. If it's lowering hardware like hooks, chain, or repel rings, make sure surfaces aren't sharp. Keep these in mind as we try a few ID challenges on the next few slides. For this first ID challenge, identify what kind of bolt and hanger it is, decide if it's trustworthy, and whether it should be replaced. Feel free to pause the video and we'll reveal the answer in a few moments. This first bolt is a 1/4-inch split shaft and it has an SMC death hanger attached to it. Note the horizontal SMC stamp. It should definitely not be trusted out at the crag. This would be a priority for replacement. For this second challenge, again ID the bolt, decide if it's trustworthy and whether it should be replaced. Pause the video and we'll reveal the answer in a few moments. This bolt is a plated 3/8-inch wedge bolt. At least that's what I'd guess upon first inspection. It has a stainless SMC hanger, but it's a little damaged. It may have been hit with some rockfall, which left it sharp. It's fairly trustworthy. This is likely from the sport climbing boom when hardware had improved. We can't use rust to tell how old this might be since there's none on the outside really. But judging by when SMC hangers were used most often, this bolt is likely 30 or more years old. It makes sense that this bolt is as rusty as it is below the surface because of the mixed metals and sped up galvanic corrosion. It would be a candidate for a replacement. For this last ID challenge, try and identify the bolt, decide if it's trustworthy and whether it should be replaced. Pause if you need to. This is a 3/8-inch sleeve bolt with a modern stainless fixed hanger. It's likely trustworthy as these sleeve bolts are all from the sport climbing boom. However, the first thing we notice is the corroded bolt head and washer. What further complicates this is mixing stainless steel with plated. This speeds up galvanic corrosion since stainless steel is more noble than plated. So these bolts are often very rusty. It's really common to see this across the front range. This would be a candidate for replacement. We're just about at the end and we'll go over some key takeaways. Bolt replacement in the front range is primarily on what we consider substandard bolts, meaning anything that's non-stainless steel, less than 3/8 in diameter, or not a textbook placement. There are various land managers with different policies around fixed anchor management in our area. Always make sure you know whose land you're on and what the regulations are. All fixed anchors and hardware have a lifespan. It's up to the collective community to maintain. As you work with the BCC anchor replacement program, keep in mind the high-level BCC policies around anchor replacement. And finally, try and have a working knowledge of identification and assessment of fixed hardware. Refer back to the slides or other resources when you need. Your next steps are taking the Part 2 training and learning how to place and remove bolts. We do this in a controlled environment with BCC tools we regularly use in the field. If you'd like to continue learning, we'll provide some additional resources. And finally, the BCC has a bad bolt tracker we encourage climbers to use. You can use your new ID and assessment skills to report bad bolts. A few additional resources include the Access Fund's best practices for bolt replacement, the American Safe Climbing Association website, and the BCC Bad Bolt Tracker. And finally, complete the Part 1 quiz to receive an invitation to Part 2.